Hello, Wendy. A huge welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here again, and I'm really grateful that you've invited me back, actually.
It just felt like it's just such a natural, like our conversation was already going that direction, wasn't it? It was like,
Yeah.
actually, this feels like it was such a wonderful conversation for us. I think there was certainly like a sense of like, this would be an enjoyable conversation for us.
Yeah.
But my hope is very much that it's going to be one that's really interesting, useful for listeners too. So, as we were just saying, there's a real kind of personal aspect to this conversation of what you could call, I don't know how to quite sum it up, but the way that autism and us serving as healers, therapists, shamanic practitioners, this variety of different roles, how more and more we've seen them, they can be two sides of the same coin. And the way that you and I have both had our kind of own personal experiences, our own stories that have like taken us to that point of realization. And so I'd love to start by hearing your story.
Yeah, sure. So my story with my autism diagnosis is like many women, especially older women. It was a late diagnosis, only a couple of years ago. It came off the back of, honestly, it was a joke. It was my husband. We were just laughing one day, and he said, "Oh, there you go again." I said, "What do you mean, there you go again?" He said, That's the autist in you." And I was like, "What?" I was genuinely taken aback. I felt insulted. I felt upset. I just felt a bit confused because at that point, I didn't feel like I was autistic. I knew that I had struggles in life. I knew there was things that didn't come easy to me that came easy to other people. And I had a view of autism that was put forward by the media. Okay. And I couldn't see myself in that. I was verbal. I was what I thought was empathic. I communicated very well. But actually, that laughing conversation was the catalyst for a number of years of deep dive and soul searching and difficulty before ultimately a diagnosis and an acceptance. And when I look back, I'm sure you'll have been the same, Lian. You look back through your life and you go, oh, that makes so much sense. Why did I not know? Why did nobody pick it up? As a child, I would get very upset when there wasn't loud noises. It was always the thing. Wendy always cried at birthday parties. I could not, even my own birthday party, I would be in the corner crying. I couldn't deal with textures. I got really scared at fireworks. I couldn't keep friends. So I was kind of lonely. I was always, if you look at me in photographs, I'm often like, they'd say, "Oh, she's away with the fairies again," just like staring off into the far distance. And that sort of followed through my young adult life. Issues at school. Academically, I loved it. It was my safe space. Okay. But socially, it was really difficult. I couldn't keep friends. I didn't understand why. Same through university. Same through up until maybe the last few years. I've finally managed to hold on to the friends and to embrace myself completely. And so the signs were there. And retrospectively, I understand now. So the diagnosis, I can't even remember when it was, maybe even just, I don't even know if it was 2 years ago. But since then, it's just been like this unfolding of just, I'm very visual. I find it really difficult to explain things just in words, but I felt like finally somebody had unlocked this cage that I was in and I could breathe. If you're just watching this with a video, I'm just like, my hands are wide and I could just finally feel, I could finally see the world. So yeah, it was a really difficult process actually, up until very recently, and I still feel like there's layers. I still feel like there's still more unmasking to do as I go through the layer and deal with trauma and then go deeper and deeper into myself. I'm like, oh, there's still more here. Okay, that's fine. We'll just take it a day at a time and just work with what I have. So it's been a lifelong journey, and I'm 41 now, and I was diagnosed in my late 30s. So yeah.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for sharing so much there that resonates for me. And I'll share a bit about my story in a moment, but what I'd love to know, and I'm sure we'll dip into this more as we talk, but over the last couple of years, as you've understood and accepted your autism, how have you joined the dots between that and your calling? How have you seen those two things kind of, again, more and more I see they're not even two separate things, they're one, and it just took me time to realize how they were one. But I'd love to know what you've seen about that.
It's a good question. So right from a really, really young age, I wanted to be a nurse or a doctor. I didn't really care which. I cared for people. I remember for my little brother, who's 6 years younger than me, every night I'd get in his bed before him, I'd warm his bed up so that he didn't have to get in a cold bed, right? I still call him my little brother, even though he's nearly 40. And he'd probably get embarrassed with me telling the story, but I was always in a caring role, and I always aspired to be a nurse or a doctor. But what happened is my parents are, they found that to be too mainstream. They're very spiritual people. My dad's no longer with us. So they found this course, this herbal medicine course. And at the point, I wasn't actually interested in herbal medicine. I think I mentioned that in our first podcast. I didn't know what herbal medicine was, but I just thought, fine, Dad thinks it's good, it must be good. So I went along, and of course, I really thrived in that space because it was tangible. It was research. It was going down the rabbit hole of really understanding how the body works. And it helped me to start making sense of my world that was, I just couldn't make sense of it. And so it started from there. And then I just kind of thought that I stayed in it because that was what I trained in. Like I graduated and I was a herbalist, so that's of course what I'm going to do. But then I look at my cohort, and of the 40 odd people that started, there are only 3 of us who are still currently practicing as herbalists. And now what I see it's like, now I see it as a calling, but it was so subconscious, Lian. It was so like, the calling was so quiet. I didn't actually realize it was a calling. It was only in hindsight that I think, oh, I was called to this course, regardless of the way I entered into it. And I've had to sort of come to terms with that I didn't choose it. It was kind of chosen for me. But I think that's part of what we're talking about. We are kind of chosen in a way. That's how it kind of feels to me anyway.
Yeah, certainly from looking at it through a shamanic lens, is that sense of we're called by the spirits to really kind of serve on their behalf, but also on the behalf of our community. And that, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone needs to work as a shaman or call themselves a shaman, but I think to a large extent there is, at an archetypal level, the way that someone is kind of like set up to work well as a shaman has a real crossover to the way that an autistic person is set up. And that's what, over the years, I've just seen more and more clearly, to the point where now it's hard to remember back to when I didn't see that, because I'm sort of so immersed in that worldview, and so many of our clients kind of like, one way or another, they may not be autistic but they're neurodivergent. I can so now see that, oh, it's designed that way, it's meant to be that way. But like you, it's certainly it's taken a long while to get to that acceptance and realization. So like you, I had looking back, in fact, I'll just like you said, like the way that this even came into my awareness, I'll start there, because I think it is often quite confronting, isn't it? That notion, certainly when you discover this in adulthood, it can be quite almost offensive. And for me, it was even though I certainly knew that I was neurodivergent in a number of ways, I just had no inkling at all that I was autistic. And then when I met my now business partner, Jonathan, it was quite early on that he said something like almost just like very confidently about me being autistic. And I had a very similar like response to you, like, sorry, like, of course I'm not. And just like thinking, you know, and I remember feeling a bit of shame as well. Like, even though I'd had difficulties, certainly kind of growing up, and particularly in my teenage years, of reading social cues and fitting in, I was just like, I've done such a good job, like, is it that obvious that I'm not actually very good? So I really took it as like, and there's been so many things over the years that he's said that turned out to be true, but at the time I had this like real resistance, and that was definitely one of those ones right at the
I recognise that.
I've had to say, like, sorry, you were right, so many times over the years. Anyway, so the years went on, and over time, more and more of our clients were very clearly set up in that kind of, like, say, more shamanic way of being. They wouldn't necessarily be shamans, but there were certainly people who are called to a kind of more magical spiritual way of serving. And then I remember there was a number of them where Jonathan would say, like, oh, I can see they're autistic too. And I was just like, you can't just keep going around saying this to people. Like, I remember one time we had quite an argument over it. And there was one particular client who he'd said it about. And then she went and got a diagnosis and was autistic. And when that happened, I was just like, oh my goodness, maybe it's right about me. And at that point, I think I'd like learned much more about how autism shows up in women. I'd had these examples of these kind of, amazing people using those gifts, that I was now starting to join the dots. And I was like, okay, so perhaps I am. And it's not really going to make much of a difference to my life now. My life is set up where I'm able to, live and work in a way that really supports me. It's not really going to fundamentally change my life to have a diagnosis, but and I think this is in itself a very autistic thing. It's just like, I would just like to know. So I like, it's all neat and in that box. And it's something then I can very much use to serve others who are perhaps where I was, 5 years ago, not understanding what this could mean. So I went into that with a very kind of conscious, this is the reason I'm going to do it. Although I was still quite, I remember when I had a clinical diagnosis with a psychiatrist, and at the end of the second kind of assessment with him, I was anticipating, because I knew someone who had gone to him, and it kind of like, it was sometime later that they were told. And he actually told me I said something like, what's the next steps? And he actually then said, oh, well, based on X, Y, and Z, I don't know how he said it, but basically, like, you are autistic. Yep. And I just like burst into tears in this, just because I was so like shocked and like relieved and all the things at once. Yep. And I remember my husband looking at me like, what's going on over there? And I said to him afterwards, it was like winning the weirdest lottery in the world, where it was just so overwhelming, not negative, but just like such a lot to be with, even though I'd already felt that I'd made my peace with it. But it was also that just like, oh my goodness, I was so obviously autistic that he was able just to tell me straight that he didn't even need to go away.
You didn't need to tally that score.
You could have like pretended it was a bit harder, but it was I think it must have been around the same time as you, because I think it was 2021, so a couple of years ago. And like you're saying, then in hindsight, I went back over my life and just was like, oh, that's why I really struggled. I mean, me in particular in school, and then my early jobs, it was so difficult. I ended up in situation after situation where I just wasn't able to understand things in the way that other people, like, there's no lack of intelligence. It was just my ability to process things in a typical way just wasn't there. And there was a real sense of compassion, actually, for that younger me who just had no clue, was doing her best, and struggled over and over. Yeah. And I think there's something really important, isn't it? Almost like a grieving of kind of maybe what could have been and what was.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
definitely feel that, Lian, as you're talking about it. I can even just feel it in myself, like the hairs on the end of the hairs on my skin are standing up, and just like that. You describe it so beautifully, but it is a grieving. It is a going back through all of the experiences, and also being that shamanic practitioner the shamanic practitioners that you and I are, traveling back in real time to those girls and young women that we were, and holding them and helping them transform through their experiences has also been a really important part of the journey. Yeah.
Yes, really beautifully said. And I think that's the part that I was aware was needed, but it can't really begin until you've had that awareness and acceptance, you know, through that lens of autism. It requires, even if you had been in, you know, healing work for a number of years beforehand, which I had, it provides a whole new lens on it, doesn't it? The experiences that just didn't really fully make sense without that understanding.
Yeah, because I mean, before my diagnosis, I'd had a lot of therapy. I'd had 10 plus years of different therapy, talking therapy, somatic type therapy, and I made big changes in my life, and I dealt with big issues. And I thought, I think I'm good. I think I'm cured or whatever. You know, that's the trauma gone. then I get the diagnosis and life falls apart again, and I'm like, okay, so what happened over the past 10 years was that I was getting my body and my mind and my soul ready to step through that door of the autistic diagnosis, and to be like, okay, now I'm at the point where I can go deeper into this, and I can really affect change backwards and forwards for myself.
I love that so much. So the way I've experienced this is there is a necessary degree of what we could call sovereignty, maturation, healing, reclamation that needs to happen so that you can do that work that we've just been talking about, go back and do the healing work that wasn't really possible without this understanding. But then also, you know, we're here in this reality now, and whilst we may not be experiencing the same kind of wounding, it still does have challenges. There are still, you know, to be in this modern world that isn't really set up particularly well for anyone actually, but
no,
particularly it really isn't. I remember I did a show a couple of years ago with the author Lucy Pearce, who's autistic, and in that conversation we were saying it's a bit like being the canary down the mine for autistic people, where we're just so much more sensitive. And we will, you know, this modern world and the way it's set up will affect us in ways that are still other people are being affected by, but not to the same degree. As we sort of provide a bit like an early warning system, like that canary down the mine. But to even know that about ourselves, I think is helpful, where it's like, I don't want to constantly be the canary down the mine. I don't want to constantly subject myself to things that aren't serving. And so I think, again, that the work that we've done to create that sovereignty allows us to be able to make choices that then serve us, that don't mean that we're constantly like exposed to this sort of sensory barrage, which is how sometimes it can feel. So I'd love to know what that's been like for you.
Yeah, this is actually a lot about what I've been thinking around autism. And as a therapist, for me, there's a few things. You talk about that, the two sides of you, the gift and the difficulties. And getting to the gift, you have to go through the difficulties. There's no way through it but through it. It's like we're going on a bear hunt. You can't go over it, you can't go under it. We've just got to go through it. I read that book to my son yesterday, so it's in the front of my mind. Yeah. And I think for me, the areas that I've really struggled with most, there are a few of them as a therapist, and I think I'll share these because, as you said, a number of your listeners are therapists or in the healing industry. But I really suffered badly from burnout, okay, overwhelm and burnout, because of the empathic attunement, you know, that feeling things so acutely, to the point where I didn't actually realise that what I was feeling wasn't mine. I had no idea, Lian, up until very recently. I just was like, this is how I'm feeling. And so that's been probably one of the most difficult pieces for me to really untangle. Because when I'm struggling to differentiate myself from others, I was just taking on so much that wasn't mine. And I was like, why am I so tired all the time? Why am I having to like retreat into a dark room with a cloth over my eyes after seeing only 2 or 3 clients? And it was coming to this through the autism diagnosis and through therapy, and then through practicing as a shamanic practitioner. And actually conversations with my husband as well. He's been super helpful. I think yours is probably kind of similar as a mirror. But I would say, hey, Josh, this is how I'm feeling. Is this mine or is this yours? So we'd practice. He would really help me to, he'd be like, actually, this is how I'm feeling right now. See how you're describing, Wendy? I'm feeling that way right now. So how about you just take a moment, take a breath, the vagal breath, 4 in, 8 out, get yourself into your rest, digest, connect state. Then you can tell me what you're feeling, just like track your body sensations. So it was that painstakingly, and it was like interaction through interaction that now I'm like, okay, so I can feel it. I've got early, like you say, the early warning. I feel the prickles, and now I know where it is in my body when I'm feeling other people's stuff or I'm feeling my stuff. I'm really clear on that now. And I have my guides, actually. I have a guardian guide who helps me with that. And so that has been absolutely life-changing, because now I'm like, I can just like sit and I can just, I know I can hold the person and I can feel what they're feeling with their permission, but it's not overwhelming and I don't take it on. And I just work with it as a kind of, okay, so this is what you're going through right now. How can we help you move through this? So that burnout through that real, like, you know, whatever you want to call it, whether it's mirror neurons or empathic attunement, that was probably one of the trickiest things for me as a therapist and as a human, actually.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And I was just considering, tell me if you would agree with this, that I think that's why seeing our I'm just going to name this from a shamanic perspective, but I'm more talking about sort of shamanically as a kind of like almost the original sort of archetype of like healing, change work, spirituality. It can obviously come in many forms, but I think certainly for me, recognizing that about myself meant that I could use those gifts in my own practice of holding myself, holding what you could call almost like psychic boundaries and spiritual boundaries. That became a way that I used those gifts that were for, like there in order to serve others in a way that was kind of more day to day, but it was essential. It could only like that I had to know that part of myself in order for it to be able to be functional day to day for my own self. It was like I couldn't have learned some of those things without also knowing myself as having those particular, say, like healing gifts.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're talking, I just sort of see that the image of that empathic attunement as like mostly in shadow. A lot of us often don't know that we even have that. Yeah. And then there's something about recognizing it, and then this is kind of cliche, but shining a light on it, and you're like, okay, this is what I've got, this is what I'm working with. That makes sense. It's that, I think as a person in this world, we're looking to make sense of things, and especially when you are neurodivergent, it's even more important to make sense of things, because so many things don't make sense. So many things I'm like, what? So that light shining in the shamanic perspective has been really helpful, and also working with certain herbs as well. I can't go through a podcast like talking about herbs, but like just there are certain herbs that really help to shine, in a shamanic sense, to shine a light on the shadow aspect of empathic attunement, like the hidden, because in the shadow it's all the realized potential. It's not just the negative, it's all of the like that gold, that diamond, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. So working with herbs like calendula and valerian and plantain and hawthorn have been absolutely a giant part of my story as well, and helping myself to mine the shadow.
Yeah, I love that so much. I was just so my own experience that links to this, but it's slightly different. For me, it wouldn't be so much that I would take on or kind of have that sort of same kind of empathy you're talking about. For me, it would be more environmental, where without realizing it, I was so open to like hearing from like every source around me. Going into a busy environment like a supermarket, even now I struggle a lot with particular, like I can cope with certain types of supermarkets, like my friends and family always joke like I could just about cope with Waitrose, but like Tesco, especially like a big Tesco's, I'd really struggle with. And it's just like everything's trying to talk to me, everything's getting my attention. And I often would come, and this was years ago, I used to think, I don't understand this. Like, there's nothing I can obviously put my finger on, but I can go to the supermarket, come back and feel like I've been just absolutely like run over by a bulldozer. And like that bit where you said you need to go to bed with a cloth, like that's exactly what I would be like. Like, I just need to go to bed. And I'm someone who has so much energy normally, and yet it was just like I have to just sort of like close off from the world because I can't take anymore. And it's now, as I began, and this also would happen in ways where I've had like experience with lots like periods where I've had lots of hallucinations and kind of feeling like things were coming in that were really scary, often unwelcome. And looking at this now from a kind of more shamanic lens, realizing it's just that kind of openness that has to be there in order to be able to work as a, you know, could you name the word like being a channel, but I don't mean that in a particularly grandiose way, but just, you know, in order for spirits to work through us, that openness has to be there. But again, without having that understanding of that's what was happening, without having the choice, the sovereign choice of like, I'm actually closed for business right now.
Yes.
Without understanding that, I was either just blasted open all the time, or was kind of having to like close myself in ways that were actually like getting in the way of me being able to use that as a gift.
I just hearing that, like it was an either or either. You were either or I was either like so wide open and overwhelmed, or so closed off. And hearing you use the shamanism as again, it's like that map to understanding. And I think the other thing that as we're kind of talking that really comes into play in that like burnout and neurodivergence and autism specifically for me is the taking things literally. I don't know if that's an experience that you have, but as a therapist, I would, and I've thought about this a lot, I would literally take on the burdens of my clients. I would take on all of their choices. I would sort of almost rob them of their sovereignty and their own, it's their healing path, it's not mine. But because I was the healer, I had to heal them, and I'm doing the quotes. And when you were talking about that conduit of spirit and the hollow bone, that was the next part of the puzzle for me. Finding out that I did take things literally. And it wasn't as obvious. It wasn't like I struggled with metaphors or anything like that. I kind of knew when somebody said, pull your socks up, they didn't literally mean pull my socks up. So it was a little bit more subtle than that. But realising that I did take things literally and that I did take on the role of healing for my clients, it enabled me to then move that focus and move that power back to them, because I was taking their power by holding them in that space, and in realizing that all I need to do as a therapist is to hold a safe and sacred space and be that hollow bone for whatever comes through. And that really helped. That really helped move me from a space of that literalness, and that I'm healing them, I've got to heal them, almost like a desperation. Like any setback that they experienced, I would berate myself that it was my fault, that I wasn't doing enough. And it wasn't always as conscious as that, Lian. It wasn't like a thought process where I go through, but in hindsight, I realised that was what I was doing. And I wonder if you had any experience of that in your practice.
It's really interesting listening to you say that, because I was thinking, I think this has shown up for me, but in a slightly different way, in that, yes, to the literalism. And then I was thinking, so I want to come back to one of the things you've said, which I've experienced slightly differently, but I think is a really important part of those of us that are working as, healers of any kind, therapy, whatever kind of it is, that the more we are working in the way that we're truly designed to work, the more we realize it's not really us doing the healing. We can't do the healing, we just don't have that power. It's not us, it really is spirit, and it's the person's own soul, their own sovereignty. Yes. And we're playing a small part in that, but it really isn't us, kind of like we're not there doing the healing. And I think the more we really understand our true role or our true part that we're playing, and the kind of the great weave, the less that we do feel this sense of like, I'm all powerful, therefore all responsible. And I think that's something really helpful for us to know, again, whatever kind of practitioner we are. I was then thinking about the ways that, and again, going back to the struggles I had, particularly at work, a lot of that was taking things literally. I've shared this story on the podcast before. I may have even mentioned it to you, but this is like a perfect example where when I was in college, I was doing a part-time job working in the snack bar of a theatre. And I was told when the shelf, like when something gets low, like a particular type of chocolate bar, can you make sure you keep it topped up so there aren't gaps? And I was like, okay, yep, I can do that. And so that gets programmed in. And then there'd be queues of people come out for the interval. And I'll be like, but there's a gap there. So like, just ignore the people waiting.
You all can wait.
Because I need to make sure there's never a gap. And so things like that, where it'll be just like that. I know what I need to do, so I will do that no matter what. And it's actually, now I so see that kind of ability to sort of like, no, this is how to do something. This is the pattern. This is the process. And it's like, once I have that clarity, I will follow that. It is like a very just like, it's embodied, and then I will follow those steps, not robotically, but almost just like the opposite, like quite fluidly, because it's like, I just have this like, oh, that's how, like, say for example, whether it's be in a shamanic healing or working a different way with a client. But it really required me to kind of like use that in like beyond the mundane of like topping up for chocolate.
Yes.
And actually, like, there's a reason that I'm able to kind of like understand those kind of like deeper, like, this is the pattern, this is the flow, and align myself with that. And after years and years of like making myself wrong for being so literal about these things, and so like, oh, this is how it's meant to be done, so therefore I will do that, like come what may, I will do that, to realize like, oh, there's a reason for it. It's okay. It actually makes me really good at certain things.
I love that. And just as you were telling me your story, it just takes me back to a couple of nights ago. My husband said to me, Wendy, I never know when what I say is going to lock into a pattern for you. He's like, sometimes I'm scared to say things in case it gets locked in, because he doesn't like the bed stand next to our bed to be messy. And that's for some reason has locked in. So now every night before I go to sleep, I'm like, I have to clear it. And I'm generally fine. I don't have repetitive patterns of behaviour, but for this, it's really locked in. But I really love how you've taken it, that focus, and looked at it through the lens of a therapist. Like, how can I use these, what is it, hyper focus and following the steps in a really positive way? Because I think that's what makes for a good therapist in a way. And it's not that robot. It's not like, oh, step 1, step 2. But I think what you're describing is that seeing a pattern in a person and be able to systematically work out what is actually going on for them, and then sort of explain it in such a way that they then understand, because you've got that process, you've got the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever, and you're showing it back to them. And I think as a herbalist, I particularly love that aspect of myself. I love that, like, this is, I can follow the river, I can follow the steps all the way back to its inception, wherever it comes from, whether it's from spirit or whether it's emotional or whether it is just a purely physical thing, which it really is. But I really love how you've just opened that world up for me there, Lian, like really describing, I'm getting excited thinking about it, how I do look into things and I will follow things through right to the bitter end, but actually just shifting the language around it. And I'm like, oh, I do that as a therapist, and that's actually really helpful. And that's actually what makes me a good detective, which I think we need to be at times.
That's actually led me to something else that has been a real area of reclamation for me. It's linked to this, but it's a specific way it showed up for me. So I think often autistic, I'm going to say women in particular, maybe autistic people, I feel like what I'm about to say is more autistic women, I think can either come in the flavor like you are, which is like the more obviously empathic, or the flavor I am, which is less the obvious kind of like the way people would describe empathy, in that it's not so much that I'm like feeling what other people feel, but I see what's happening, like a very clear pattern level. And in fact, it can actually make me seem like the opposite of empathic, quite cold, because I can be so focused on it at a kind of like, it's almost like, you know, you get, I think it's Minority Report, that film where it's like, oh, there's like this 3D thing like in front of them.
Yes, it goes dook, 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 dook. Yeah.
Like, it can like open up like that, where I can just see, oh, okay, this is where someone is, and I can see that wounding has created this and this, and then this is also impacting the way that they've shown up in that relationship, which then I'm looking back at the thing they said right at the beginning of this conversation, that symbol there, I can now see why that was rooted in their wounding, and it's just all sort of there, visible. And I'm not really, it's not like I have like an emotional connection to it at a human level. It's literally like it's a picture, and I can just see it very clearly. And before I really understood why that allowed me to do what I do, I or other people would make me wrong for that, almost like I'm a bit cold, you know, a bit like again robotic, in that it's just like, for me it's very like very clear, very black and white, like this is what's happening. And I would clearly over the years get better at naming these things in a softer way and a kind of like less direct way, or just not saying it at all depending on the circumstance. Learn that. But the more I've understood, like in the right setting, in the right context, it literally is a gift. It's what allows me to do what I do, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can be used for good or evil. There's certainly like reclamation from shadow that's needed, but inherently it is a gift. It's a skill that absolutely helps me to serve.
Yeah, I just see it like, just like, you notice details, right? You notice things that a lot of people are not even aware, and I think that that's a really important part of what we're talking about. It's that in our effort to understand the world, I say in the efforts to understand the world, I notice details about people and about things that a lot of other people just don't need to notice. And I hear what you're saying is like, that helps us to build a picture of the person that we're with, because we're using it in a therapeutic sense. We're chasing those details down, whereas I think they might be lost on other people. But I think it also, I'm really taking what you're saying about it can seem a bit cold, because I am a very empathic person, but I have been guilty in the past of almost focusing too much on the details. I guess we're talking about like dark and light of these gifts. I would focus so much on the details that I would forget to have a look around at the bigger picture. I see you maybe describe it a bit differently. You can maybe see the bigger picture, but my particular like flavour would mean that I would sometimes focus on the wrong detail even, and I would follow that down a rabbit hole to be like, oh no, wait, it's not actually about mast cell activation syndrome, whatever you want to, it's because they don't have a supportive community or something. So I think for me, realising that searching for details is useful, but I also have to pause and go, all right, I'm actually looking at a human here. Because sometimes I forget, honestly, sometimes I forget when I'm like almost like an autopsy, like just like searching around for details. And so it's nice just to stop and step back. And I'll say to a client, tell me a story. Like, just tell me a story. And then that way, if I feel myself like getting a bit crazy with the detail, I just like get a little nod from the guide, and I'll just say, just tell me a story, and I'll stop trying to search those details down.
I love that so much. The time's flying by, and I just love this conversation. There's just so much in this that I think is, again, although these are our own personal experiences, there's certainly so much of what we've been talking about, because so many of our clients are neurodivergent, or are actually autistic. These are things that I've absolutely seen show up over and over again in those people who are also doing similar work to we are. So I know that we're not just talking personally. These are more, going back to patterns, these are patterns that I can see are held in common. And I think I might have mentioned this to you last time we spoke. One of the things that really hit me and kind of blew my mind, but simultaneously was a bit like a kind of, oh, okay, that really makes sense. All around the same time as me being diagnosed with autism, I think it was like 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after, it was right around the same period, I read some research that was talking about how the autistic brain, the pineal gland, hypermetabolizes DMT. That's like natural innate DMT, which many people know is like described often as the spirit molecule. It's kind of like a form of it's often in different kinds of teacher plants, psychedelics. And it was because for me, so much of my journey before understanding like why this was happening came in the form of these kind of like quite odd experiences, like intrusive, like sort of like hallucinations and kind of psychedelic kind of like experiences. Naturally, I wasn't taking psychedelics at the time, and it was just like, oh, that suddenly makes sense. It isn't just like a sort of something wrong with me. This is an aspect of the way, and I think it doesn't necessarily have to come in like I had quite an extreme form, but more we're talking about like an openness to other realms. If you think that's what the role of what a DMT does, as far as we can understand it, it is opening up to other realms, to more spiritual realms, you could say, that seems to be like a natural aspect of autism. And knowing that changed so much for me. It's like explained so much that still I'm kind of discovering, but it's like, oh my goodness, knowing that puts a whole nother light on what autism is. I was
hearing you, it was actually, I didn't know that about the pineal gland. I watched one of your videos, And I was like, oh, yes, I'm going down this rabbit hole. And I went down the rabbit hole and I was thoroughly excited and impressed.
I want to go down.
Yeah, let's go down that rabbit hole. Because I'm what's known as a dry shaman. I don't work with hallucinogenics. All the plants that I work with are just our native plants. I say just, they're our native plants, and they are teacher plants. But they also help us to access that indigenous innate DMT.
Yeah.
But then I think about my own experience training as a shamanic practitioner, and it always seemed to come easy. I never struggled in journeying. I could, like, at a drop of a hat, and I would see other people struggle, and I'm like, but it's easy. I don't understand why you don't. And I never would say that. Of course, I do have enough self-awareness that I could just now just keep my mouth shut. You know, just Wendy, it's okay. You don't need to say this, even though I'm like, every inch of me is like desperate to say it. But I love that you just are bringing all this stuff to light, because what does it do? It makes sense of things in this world, in this Western culture. We don't have that history of elders to be like, you know what you're experiencing, Wendy? This is a normal like rite of passage that you're going through. The reason that tree is speaking to you is because of the fact that you are autistic and you do have access to this endogenous chemical. It's not all of it, it's not everything, of course, but it is a part of it. So I really love that you put that into my consciousness.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I felt exactly the same when it was written to my awareness. I was just like, oh my goodness, I feel such gratitude that it's not something that's talked about very often at all. And I think because generally autism's researched as a disorder, and like, what good is it to know that aspect? No one's looking at it from a kind of more, say, spiritual lens. But knowing that really changed so much for me. There was something else I just felt came to my awareness that was around this area. What was it? I love the way you brought the trees in, by the way, because that we spoke about that quite
our fellow oak experiences.
Yes, yeah, I love that.
Our oak awakenings.
Oh, that was it. It was more just a funny story came to mind when you were saying in when you were training in shamanism, and how you kind of like, you managed not to say like, why are you guys struggling? And unfortunately, going back a number more years ago, I didn't quite have that awareness. It wasn't quite as bad as it could sound, but I had, which I can now understand, when my father died 11 years ago, it was like I had a kind of very big, spontaneous spiritual awakening. And I then went on to sort of train in a particular spiritual tradition. But because, again, not knowing at the time, because of this openness to these other realms, it was all just coming. It was like so obvious to me. It was just like, I like the things that the teachers are saying is like, of course, like we almost don't need to be taught this, because of course it's like already here. And I was at this particular retreat, and I remember asking a question, which was something along the lines of, I was puzzling me. I was thinking, like, why are we here for like day after day after day, hearing these things when it's just like, it's here. It's like obvious. It's all here. And I remember asking that exact question. Meanwhile, of course, everyone else isn't there, and I'm all like, sorry, I genuinely don't understand. Like,
I love that.
And I look back at that, and I was just like, oh, bless my heart. Like,
oh, I know, right?
Anyway, hopefully these days I'd have a little bit more awareness of that. But at the time, like, I was just oblivious. I was genuinely puzzled. Anyway, so bringing it, moving gently to a close, as much as I definitely could speak far more about this with you. What do you think is helpful for people listening to know, which may either be the case that they already are working as, you know, practitioners of some kind in the healing professions, and either know either suspect or maybe know they're neurodivergent or suspect they are, and are hearing like, there may be something more here for me to discover. Or perhaps the other way, they actually know already that they are autistic, but haven't really leaned into the way that this can be a gift in the way that they work. What would you like them to know? I'm hoping there's so much in the conversation we've already had, but what would you say to them would be a really helpful next step for them?
You finish on big questions, don't you, Lian? Should have knew that from last time. Do you know, I think it comes down to looking at what is it that you're struggling with? What are your biggest struggles? And that's where you have to shine a light. That's where you have to lean into. Because that's our shadow giving us little glimpses of the gold. That's what's on the other side. What's on the other side of those struggles. And that's what it's been for me. It's been leaning into those really difficult things and not running away from them. And that's been absolutely transformative for me. And I continue to do that. I think that I'm done. I think that I'm like, tie that little bow up in a neat little, neat little bow and I'm good to go. But no, it's leaning into those really difficult things and shining a light onto those things we don't want to look at.
I love that so much. Funny enough, I haven't posted yet, but I was writing an article about alchemy from a psychological perspective this morning. And I said in that, even though it's seen as a kind of linear set of stages, really to a large extent, it's cyclical. And there'll be kind of aspects of us that perhaps we've gone sort of further into, often it's named as like 4 stages. We'd have gone further into those stages with some parts, but there's still some parts that we really need to begin the work on. And in this week's podcast, I spoke to a Jungian psychotherapist, and we were talking very specifically about the descent, that kind of like entering into the darkness, into the shadow.
Ooh.
And I think I wasn't really thinking about this through this frame when I was having that conversation with her or when I was writing the article, but now I reflect upon it, I'm like, that isn't easy for anyone, when we're encouraged to just do what we can to keep on keeping on, keep functioning. If you can keep functioning, do that, don't dare like look anywhere that might
do not stop and look.
No. And what's really occurring to me listening to you saying that with that context is, I think that can be even more of a challenge for an autistic person that's devoted their life to coping, devoted their life to like, how can I fit in? How can I mask? How can I learn the ways of this world so that I can just about function in it? It can be even more challenging to kind of like start to look in those places that we've just done our best to like just not even have to go there.
Thank you for finishing with that, because honestly that's been my experience, and I think that's been an experience of a lot of the people that I work with and work alongside, as you spend so much of your life trying not to be you. It's really difficult to actually be you when you don't even know who you is. You don't even know who you is.
The beautiful part of this, though, the gold is that you, that true you, that whole you that lies, once all those parts are brought back, is like so much more beautiful, so much brighter, so much more powerful than it's possible to even conceive of. When I look back, before I had any understanding of this, I think, my goodness, I would have been blown away if I could have seen what was to come.
If you could have seen the Lian sort of glowing, I love that.
As an absolutely gorgeous conversation, and I'm sure listeners would love to find out more about you and your wonderful work. Where can they do that?
So you can find me at wendydooner.com, or you can follow me on Instagram, wendy.shamanic herbalist. I run courses, I do one-to-ones. You can connect with me as peers as well. Always looking to connect with like-minded folks to help support us in the work that we do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, my dear. This has been such a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.